I'd like to give the board a brief presentation on zero-based budgeting and the advantages for our organization. So let's start by what is a zero-based budget. So what is it? Every line item on the budget must be approved. So as you know from historical budgets, we take into consideration the previous budget and we build upon that, whether there's increases or decreases based on census and cost. Well, with a zero-based budget, every line item is re-examining starting from the 0 point. There's no preference to previous expenses. So let's say last year we spent a certain amount on supplies. We don't take that number into consideration in this budget. We need to take into consideration what we have prioritized for the expense of those supplies. In looking at the zero-based budget, requires a thorough evaluation of every line item within the budget. And then, again, I mentioned the zero-based budget, as its name indicates. The zero-based budget starts at zero. So in traditional budgeting, as you can see, it starts what was the previous number, and in this case was $1 million. And then basically you re-examine the budget from there. And with a zero-based budget, you start with zero, and then you move towards the ultimate goal based on what you have in terms of revenues and expenses. Moving along, why is it relevant? The current approach is not well defined. In other words, when you look at the current budget, you don't examine every line item to determine what is built in each of those line items. And with a zero-based budget, since you're doing a thorough examination, you're looking at what's built in to each individual cost. The dollars in a traditional budget are almost automatically assigned based on previous fiscal year history, whereas with a zero-based budget, you're starting at zero. In other words, you're starting from the beginning point. And then the budgeted dollars are allocated and increased or decreased with a zero-based budget so that you can make sure you get an accurate number in your budget. And then also the current healthcare environment is very important to us as an organization because, as we know, healthcare reimbursement is decreasing and our costs are always constantly increasing. So this is important to us. That's why it's relevant. And moving along, also like to point out the advantages. It's an efficient allocation of resources with zero-based budgeting. It detects inflated budgets, and it also drives managers to be cost-effective. Cost-effective being one of the most important things for the sustainability of the organization in order to improve operations. As far as the disadvantages of a zero-based budget, it's time-consuming because you have to look at each line within the budget. It requires training on how this specific budget type works. And in large organizations, the amount of time can be a little bit overwhelming and burdensome for the staff. But we do believe that it has a benefit for our organization. Also like to point out and give you a little bit of graphics on zero-based budgeting, just so you can see a little bit about why it's important. If we had more patients, obviously you would see revenues increasing and you would see expenses normally increase per year. So the difference between that revenue and expense would be your net profit, and obviously the organization wants to have a positive net profit. Whereas in our current healthcare environment, we have less reimbursement and less patients. So as you can see, it's a little different of a curve. You have revenues decreasing, whereas you have increase in expenses. That difference results in a net loss, which ultimately will have a negative impact with the organization over time, and this is of course a one-year period. Examples of that would be nurse-patient ratios in our organization. We have less reimbursement per patient, but yet we continue to have the same number of nurses in a traditional budget. If we're looking at a zero-based budget, you would start all over and determine how much expense you need to allocate for the nurses in order for the budget to be sustainability. And medical supplies also is another example in our particular organization, where in a traditional budget, those medical supply expenses would remain the same, and in a zero-based budget, we would decrease those expenses based on priority and based on the amount of revenue received. Thank you very much for this time that you've allowed me to present zero-based budgeting and the importance of this type of budget for our organization and the positive impacts it could have for us in the long term. Thank you.